The rain fell in sheets across the academy grounds, turning the parade field into a canvas of gray misery. Lieutenant Jordan Reeves stood at attention, his pristine uniform somehow remaining crisp despite the deluge, watching the newest batch of officer candidates struggle through their first tactical exercise. His eyes, however, were fixed on something else, a crumpled olive-drab field jacket lying in the mud near the observation post. "Someone should really pick that up," he muttered to himself, loud enough for the candidates nearby to hear. "Looks unprofessional." The jacket belonged to a woman standing 20 meters away. She was unremarkable in appearance, medium height, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing civilian hiking clothes that had seen better days. No insignia, no badges, no indication of rank or authority. Just another Pentagon observer, Reeves had assumed when he'd seen her name on the morning roster. Dr. Sarah Chen, Department of Defense Operational Assessment. Reeves had been top of his class at Officer Candidate School. At 26, he'd already served 2 tours and earned his commission through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, or so his evaluations had said. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was headed, up the chain of command, straight to the stars he'd dreamed about since childhood. The woman, Chen, stood motionless as the exercise unfolded below. Her hands were loose at her sides, her breathing even despite the cold. While the candidates around her shifted nervously, checking their gear and muttering about the weather, she remained still as stone. Her focus was absolute, her gaze tracking something in the valley that Reeves couldn't quite identify. "Probably never been in the field," Reeves said to the candidate beside him, loud enough to carry. "These policy types come out here, think they understand what we do because they read a report." A few nervous laughs rippled thr. Oof the group. Reeves felt the familiar warmth of validation. He was the authority here, the combat veteran, the leader these fresh-faced candidates looked up to. This civilian woman with her muddy boots and simple clothes represented everything he'd learned to distrust: bureaucracy, oversight, the dead hand of those who made rules from safe distances. What Reeves couldn't see was Colonel Marcus Webb, standing in the tree line 300 meters away with a pair of high-powered optics. Webb had been watching Chen since she'd arrived, his weathered face unreadable. When he'd seen her jacket fall, knocked from the railing by an awkward candidate, and watched her leave it there without comment, he'd understood immediately. She was testing them. Always testing. The exercise began to collapse with devastating speed. Blue Team's point element walked straight into an ambush that any first-year cadet should have anticipated. Their communications dissolved into chaos, voices overlapping in panic. Reeves, who'd approved the tactical plan himself, began issuing corrections, but his commands only added to the confusion. He was trying to force his pre-planned strategy onto a situation that had already evolved beyond it. "Flanking maneuver, now," he barked into the radio. "Echo Squad, suppress that position." But Echo Squad was already pinned down, and his flanking route would expose them to a secondary position he dismissed during planning as unlikely to be manned. The candidates were losing. Badly. Chen moved. If you're enjoying this story of quiet competence defeating loud arrogance, make sure to subscribe to The Final Watch for more tales where true leadership speaks louder than rank. Now, back to the story. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked to the tactical display table where a junior candidate was frantically trying to update positions. She picked up a dry erase marker, red, the color of enemy forces, and held it over the laminated map. The candidate looked up, about to protest, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. They weren't angry or commanding. They were simply the eyes of someone who was now in charge, as naturally as water flowing downhill. 3 strokes on the map. That's all it took. The first traced a drainage ditch that snaked along the eastern slope, concealment no one had noticed. The second marked a small rocky rise that provided perfect overwatch of the enemy's key position. The third was an arrow, simple and direct, showing the path from point A to point B. She hadn't created a plan. She'd revealed what the terrain had been offering all along. "You," she said, pointing to a reserve squad leader. Her voice was quiet but carried absolute clarity. "Take that drainage ditch. Set up overwatch on that rise. Suppress the machine gun nest." She pointed to a communications specialist. "You go with them. Line of sight only. Fire corrections. Nothing else on the net." Finally, to a medic standing uselessly nearby, "You follow in the ditch. Your casualties are here." She tapped a precise spot on the map. "You'll reach them in 6 minutes." The squad leader didn't hesitate. He didn't ask who she was or by what authority she gave orders. He simply nodded, "Yes, ma'am," and moved. His squad followed with the swift efficiency of professionals who'd just been given clarity in chaos. The transformation was immediate. The panicked radio chatter stopped. Precise, calm reports began flowing from the overwatch position. "In position. Engaging target. 30 seconds later, enemy nest neutralized. Then, medic on site. Treating casualties. 6 minutes." Exactly as she'd predicted. The exercise wasn't just saved. It was won decisively. Reeves stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, humiliation, and something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding. He stared at the map, at the 3 simple lines she'd drawn. Why hadn't he seen it? It was so obvious now. The candidates around him were silent, watching this civilian woman who just demonstrated a level of tactical intuition they'd only read about in their textbooks. Chen stepped back from the table, wiped the marker on her pants, and resumed her quiet observation as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Into that stunned silence walked Colonel Webb. He emerged from the tree line with the deliberate pace of a man who'd seen 40 years of service. His eyes swept past the candidates, past Reeves, and settled on Chen. He walked directly to her and stopped exactly 6 feet away, a formal, respectful distance. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them, some shared history that existed in the space between words. Then Colonel Webb, a man who'd commanded battalions in 3 different theaters of war, did something that sent shockwaves through every person present. He saluted. A sharp, perfect salute that belonged in front of the highest-ranking officers in the military. "General Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "I apologize, ma'am. I wasn't informed you'd be personally conducting the assessment today." The word "general" hung in the air like thunder. Reeves felt the blood drain from his face. The confident smirk he'd worn just minutes ago crumbled. General. The quiet woman in civilian clothes. The jacket in the mud. He'd just publicly disrespected a general officer. Chen gave Webb the smallest nod. "It's been educational, Marcus," she said dryly. Webb held the salute until she acknowledged it, a public display of deference that left no doubt about the hierarchy here. When he finally dropped his hand, he turned slowly to address the assembled candidates. "I believe some of you," he began, his voice stripped of all warmth, "are operating under a profound misunderstanding about who you've been sharing this field with today." He gestured to Chen. "This is Major General Sarah Chen. For those of you whose military history doesn't extend beyond last semester's exam, allow me to educate you." The silence was absolute. General Chen spent the last 15 years in Special Operations Command. "The counterinsurgency tactics you study in your advanced courses?" She wrote the manual, literally wrote it, based on operations she personally commanded in places you don't have clearance to know about. Webb's gaze swept across the group, lingering on Reeves. Her official record includes 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 4 Silver Stars, and a Bronze Star with Valor device. Her unofficial record, the one that actually matters, includes hundreds of soldiers who came home alive because of decisions she made under circumstances that would break every single one of you. He paused, letting the weight settle. She retired last year as a 2-star general and is here at my personal request to assess our training protocols. She is a living embodiment of operational excellence. Webb's eyes locked onto Reeves. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more menacing. And you implied she didn't understand the field. The story of what happened on Range 7 spread through the academy like a shockwave. It wasn't gossip. It was the birth of a legend. Within days, every candidate knew about the Chen correction or, as it came to be called, the muddy jacket lesson. The narrative was perfect, a cautionary tale about assumptions, arrogance, and the quiet power of genuine expertise. Candidates who hadn't witnessed it firsthand told the story as if they had, each retelling adding to its mythic quality. Lieutenant Reeves became a different person. The swagger vanished, replaced by something harder to define, humility tempered with determination. He was the first to arrive at training and the last to leave. He stopped talking and started listening. He asked questions instead of providing answers. 3 days after the incident, he found General Chen in the academy library. She was reading a worn copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. He approached with a hesitation entirely foreign to his nature. In his hands was the olive-drab jacket, cleaned and pressed. He placed it on the table without speaking. Chen closed her book slowly and looked at the jacket, then at him. "Ma'am," he began, his voice rough with unfamiliar humility. "I have no excuse for my conduct. My arrogance blinded me. I was wrong, and I apologize." He braced for judgment, for the lecture he deserved. Instead, Chen simply nodded. "You made an assessment based on incomplete information," she said, her tone analytical rather than accusatory. "It's a common error. Here, it cost you pride. In combat, it costs lives. Learn from it." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Lieutenant." What followed was an hour-long private tutorial from one of the finest tactical minds in modern military history. She taught him not just tactics, but a way of seeing, a philosophy of leadership rooted in observation, adaptation, and humility before the reality of terrain. The grease marker Chen had used was retrieved and mounted in a shadow box in the main briefing room. The accompanying plaque read simply, "See the ground, not the rank. The battlefield respects only competence. S. Chen." Range 7 became unofficially known as Chen's Overlook among the candidates. Being assigned an exercise there became both an honor and a test, a reminder that the earth beneath their feet had lessons to teach if they were willing to listen. Years passed. The rain-soaked fields of the academy gave way to the scorching heat of a remote forward operating base in a contested valley halfway around the world. Captain Reeves, no longer the arrogant lieutenant, stood over a tactical map spread across the hood of an MRAP. An IED strike had disabled 2 vehicles. Communications were intermittent. A dust storm was moving in, cutting them off from air support. A young lieutenant beside him pointed at the map with barely controlled panic. "Sir, standard procedure says we establish a defensive perimeter here and wait for the quick reaction force." Reeves studied the map, but he was seeing beyond it. He was reading the terrain, the dry riverbed to the west, the way the wind was sculpting the dunes, creating new avenues of approach. He shook his head slowly. "The textbook doesn't account for this storm, Lieutenant. Or that wadi. If we stay here, we're a stationary target." He picked up a stick and drew in the sand. His movements were swift and certain, an echo of something he'd witnessed years ago in the rain. "We're using the storm as cover. We'll take the wadi to the high ground. From there, we control the valley." The lieutenant looked doubtful. "Sir, that's high risk. It's not standard doctrine." Reeves looked at the young officer and saw his former self reflected back, the certainty, the rigidity, the blindness. He smiled slightly. "Let me tell you a story, Lieutenant," he said, his voice calm against the rising wind. "It's about a muddy jacket, 3 lines on a map, and the difference between reading doctrine and reading ground. As he spoke, his soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, following his orders because he'd earned their trust through consistent, competent leadership. He'd learned his lesson well. He'd become the kind of leader General Chen had known he could be. Back at the academy, the story endured. Every new class of candidates heard it during their first week of field training. An old sergeant major would gather them at Chen's overlook and tell them about the civilian woman who'd outthought the academy's brightest candidate. He'd tell them that rank is responsibility, not privilege, and that arrogance is a weight that will drown you. The story had become foundational mythal. Ogei, a moral compass for the institution. It reminded them that the true measure of a leader wasn't in their posture on the parade ground, but in their clarity of thought under pressure. General Chen's legacy wasn't a statue or a building with her name. It was something more powerful, a standard. A quiet voice in the conscience of every candidate who heard her story, whispering, "Be humble. Be observant. Be competent. Let your actions speak." The true uniform of leadership isn't woven from fabric or decorated with ribbons. It's forged from experience, from hard decisions in impossible situations, from earning respect one correct call at a time. General Chen had worn that invisible uniform her entire career. On that rainy day, the candidates had seen only civilian clothes, a thin veneer of the ordinary. They'd failed to see the general underneath. Not the rank conferred by regulation, but the authority earned through decades of silent, dedicated service. Her true power wasn't in the stars she'd worn on her shoulders, but in the clarity of her vision and the steadiness of her judgment. The jacket in the mud had been a perfect metaphor. Arrogance had tried to diminish something it didn't understand, only to discover that true value cannot be soiled by disrespect. The ultimate lesson was one of perception. Reeves and the other candidates had looked at Chen and seen what they expected, a powerless outsider. Chen had looked at a chaotic battlefield and seen what was actually there, an elegant solution hiding in plain sight. What you see is determined by who you are. An arrogant mind sees only symbols and status, and is therefore blind. A humble mind sees reality, and is therefore powerful. Legacy isn't a monument people look at. It's a lesson you plant inside them, a seed that grows and spreads long after you're gone. General Chen's legacy was now flourishing in 1,000 places, in a captain's calm voice during a sandstorm, in a lieutenant's newfound humility, in the culture of an entire institution. She hadn't needed to return wearing her uniform to demand respect. The uniform had merely been official recognition of authority she'd already earned 1,000 times over in silence and obscurity. Her real victory was proving that rank is just a symbol. The true substance is the character of the person beneath it. For more stories where demonstrated competence triumphs over empty assumptions, and where quiet professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to The Final Watch, where we share tales of leadership, honor, and the invisible uniforms that matter most.